In the summer of 1914, Europe was a continent on edge. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo had sent shockwaves through the capitals of empires. In Paris, cafe terraces buzzed with debates, the aroma of strong coffee mingling with anxious murmurs. Economists were already speculating on the potential disruption to trade. Shipments of coal from Britain were slowing, and German factories were recalibrating for possible wartime production. In Vienna, orchestras played as if oblivious to the brewing storm, while families packed heirlooms into trunks, unsure of what the months ahead might bring. Soldiers, young and barely out of school, kissed their mothers goodbye at train stations lined with iron rails and tearful crowds. Letters flew back and forth, post offices overwhelmed with messages, some casual, some brimming with foreboding. Across the countryside, farmers continued to harvest wheat, unaware that fields would soon be battlegrounds. Shops in London raised prices slightly, anticipating scarcity, while insurance agents whispered about war bonds as the surest investment. And everywhere, a strange cocktail of excitement, fear, and patriotic fervor hung in the air, like the electric hum before a storm. By autumn of 1914, the reality of war had begun to settle over the Western Front. Trenches carved into muddy fields stretched as far as the eye could see. Soldiers huddled under makeshift shelters, sharing stories of home to mask the cold and the fear. Letters from Parisian cafes, Vienna apartments, and London homes were a lifeline, but often arrived stained with mud or torn in transit. Economically, the war was already straining resources. Ration cards appeared in Germany, while British farmers were urged to increase wheat production to feed both civilians and troops. Soldiers traded small items like chocolate, cigarettes, and buttons to maintain a semblance of normal life. Night watches were lit by flickering lanterns, revealing portraits of loved ones pinned to wooden walls. Gas drills became a grim routine, a reminder that death could come not just from bullets, but invisible clouds. Despite everything, camaraderie blossomed. Shared meals, whispered jokes, and makeshift letters carved on scraps of paper became treasures. Far behind the lines, towns prepared for refugees, while local markets swelled with prices as demand exceeded supply. Every day, the young men learned that bravery was not just heroism, but enduring boredom, cold, hunger, and longing. And as artillery boomed in the distance, the world felt simultaneously enormous and suffocatingly small. By the winter of 1915, European cities had begun to feel the weight of the war. In London, blackout curtains were drawn as night fell early, street lamps dimmed, and families huddled indoors. Shops displayed empty shelves or rationed goods, while bakery windows bore lines of citizens waiting hours for a loaf of bread. In Paris, children learned patriotic songs in schools while mothers knitted warm clothing for soldiers at the front. Newspapers carried stories of heroic deeds alongside grim casualty lists, blending pride with fear. Factories operated around the clock, producing munitions instead of luxury goods, and workers' strikes became rare but dangerous, as dissent was equated with disloyalty. In Berlin, families received news of distant relatives from the front. Some letters cheered on by hope, others drowned in worry. Cafes that once hummed with philosophical debates now whispered political opinions carefully, aware of censors' eyes. Markets were an arena of survival, with prices rising and barter increasingly common. Smoke from coal fires filled chimneys, as households stretched every bit of fuel. And despite the hardship, art and literature flourished subtly, offering both escape and reflection in candlelit rooms. By spring 1915, the war had transformed the countryside as much as the cities. Field hospitals sprang up in barns and schools, their corridors filled with the groans of wounded soldiers. Nurses, often young women with barely any formal training, moved tirelessly between stretchers, cleaning, bandaging, and comforting the injured. Civilians volunteered to sew uniforms, carry supplies, or deliver food to families who had lost fathers, brothers, and husbands. Economically, local markets strained under the surge of demand for food, medicine, and clothing. Streets in small towns were quieter than before. Carts laden with supplies rumbled past empty houses where men had marched off to fight. Letters from the front were read aloud in living rooms, bringing relief, despair, and sometimes laughter when tales of clumsy soldiers were shared. Factories now trained women to replace men on the assembly lines, producing weapons, uniforms, and other wartime essentials. Trains carried not only troops, but also wounded soldiers back home, their arrival marked by a mix of relief and fear. And in cafes and public squares, conversations were colored with both the hope for victory and the anxiety for loved ones still in battle. Despite the pain, communities found resilience, discovering unexpected bonds amid scarcity, loss, and the unending rhythm of war. By the summer of 1915, the face of warfare had begun to change dramatically. Artillery had grown heavier and more precise, capable of leveling entire villages, while machine guns created deadly lines that no soldier could easily cross. Tanks, still experimental, rumbled across muddy fields, breaking barbed wire and shocking both allies and enemies. Communication technology evolved as well. Field telephones and signal flares replaced slower couriers, though lines were frequently cut in the chaos. Soldiers learned to read maps with new urgency, plotting not just attacks but survival. Economically, nations poured resources into research and production, prioritizing steel, explosives, and chemical experiments. Gas warfare, a terrifying innovation, forced soldiers to carry masks at all times, and medical units scrambled to treat invisible injuries. Behind the lines, engineers worked day and night to produce these technological marvels, often living in makeshift factories that smelled of oil and smoke. Civilians observed with awe and fear as convoys of new machines rolled past, reshaping familiar landscapes into battle-ready zones. Propaganda celebrated technological superiority, hoping to boost morale despite the mounting human cost. Yet amidst the destruction and innovation, small acts of ingenuity, improvised shelters, clever signaling, and creative camouflage reminded soldiers that adaptability was as critical as bravery. By the winter of 1916, European cities were struggling under the strain of war. Food rationing had become strict. Families lined up at dawn for bread, meat, and sugar, often waiting for hours in icy streets. Coal shortages made heating homes a daily challenge, while candlelight illuminated cramped apartments. Women increasingly managed households alone, balancing work, childcare, and volunteer efforts for war relief. Neighborhoods organized soup kitchens and clothing drives, turning scarcity into small acts of communal care. Shops raised prices cautiously, aware that any sudden hike could spark unrest, while black markets thrived in hidden corners. Newspapers and posters emphasized patriotism, urging citizens to endure hardship for the sake of victory. Children played in snow-covered streets, using imagination to transform emptiness into playgrounds, their laughter a fragile reminder of normal life. Economists worried about inflation, yet government spending on munitions and transport continued to swell, redirecting money from civilian needs. Despite the daily challenges, cultural life persisted. Theaters, clandestine concerts, and literary circles offered brief respite and reflection. And through it all, a sense of quiet resilience emerged, binding communities with shared endurance and hope. By spring 1916, soldiers on the Western Front had settled into a grim rhythm. Trenches, filled with mud and water, became both home and prison, and every day brought the tension of artillery bombardments. Yet amid the hardship, small rituals preserved humanity. Men shared letters, chocolate, and tobacco, turning meager supplies into tokens of comfort. Some carved tiny figurines or wrote poems to pass the long hours of waiting. Night watches were punctuated by whispered jokes and stories of home, creating fleeting moments of camaraderie. Officers encouraged reading, chess, or card games to distract minds from the endless noise of war. Medics moved tirelessly, attending injuries, patching uniforms, and offering reassurance. Occasionally, the sound of birds or distant church bells reminded soldiers of a life beyond the trenches. Economically, the army supplied rations and essentials, yet shortages were common, and soldiers improvised daily, using scraps of food creatively. Letters from civilians provided hope and connection, sometimes prompting laughter at minor misunderstandings or quirky observations. And despite the mud, the cold, and the omnipresent fear, friendships formed in these trenches became bonds that would last a lifetime. By summer 1916, life behind the front lines had adapted to the demands of war. Women filled roles once reserved for men, working in factories, offices, and farms, often for long hours and meager wages. Children helped at home, carrying water, tending gardens, or assisting in small family businesses. Schools were often partially closed, but lessons included practical skills for survival, like cooking with limited ingredients or basic first aid. Markets were bustling yet strained, with long lines for sugar, flour, and meat, and bartering became a common practice. Community kitchens and sewing circles thrived, transforming raw materials into clothes, blankets, and bandages. Newspapers reported the latest battles, ration rules, and government appeals for war savings, shaping public opinion while keeping families informed. Despite the hardships, families found creative ways to celebrate birthdays, religious holidays, or small victories, often around shared meals lit by candles or stoves. Economically, Governments encouraged savings bonds and war loans, asking citizens to invest in the nation's future. Even leisure found a place. Reading clubs, amateur concerts, and small theatrical performances offered brief escapes. And through it all, resilience and solidarity grew, creating a home front that, while burdened, refused to crumble under the weight of war. By autumn 1916, the psychological toll of war was evident across Europe. Soldiers wrote letters not just to communicate, but to hold on to sanity, reading them aloud to friends as a momentary escape. Chaplains moved through muddy trenches, offering prayers and quiet counsel, while makeshift crosses and small altars appeared near the front lines. In towns, citizens attended candlelit services, often praying for missing or wounded loved ones. Concerts, poetry readings, and theatrical performances provided temporary reprieve from the relentless news of battles and casualties. Children drew pictures for soldiers, sending small gifts like knitted socks or letters with colorful illustrations. Soldiers found comfort in music, singing old folk songs, or humming melodies from home during brief moments of peace. Economically, local artisans adapted, crafting small religious icons, amulets, and keepsakes for families separated by war. Community celebrations, even in minimal form, reinforced bonds and offered psychological support. Posters and newspapers emphasized perseverance and hope, blending patriotism with spiritual reassurance. And despite exhaustion, fear, and grief, these rituals, both small and large, helped maintain a fragile sense of normalcy and humanity in a world dominated by conflict. By winter 1916, the war had expanded beyond trenches to the skies and seas. Naval blockades choked ports, slowing the flow of food, coal, and raw materials, while U-boats prowled the Atlantic, turning merchant ships into floating targets. Coastal cities braced for raids, and families watched convoys with a mixture of hope and dread. In the air, biplanes conducted reconnaissance missions, dropping small bombs or photographing enemy positions. Pilots faced freezing winds and rudimentary safety measures, relying on courage and ingenuity to survive. Economically, nations redirected shipyards and factories to build destroyers, submarines, and aircraft, straining civilian resources further. Telegraph and radio networks expanded, allowing faster communication, but interception and espionage added tension. Sailors and pilots developed unique routines to endure long, lonely watches, sharing stories and practical tips to stay alive. Newspapers reported heroic deeds at sea and in the air, blending awe with anxiety for loved ones on distant fronts. Artists captured these scenes in sketches and paintings, emphasizing both the mechanical power of war and the human courage required to wield it. And despite the technological arms race, life at home and on the front adapted, finding ways to cope with the ever-expanding scope of conflict. By spring 1917, the war had deeply altered rural life. Fields that once produced abundant crops now struggled under labor shortages, as many young men had marched to the front. Women, children, and the elderly tended farms with relentless determination, plowing, sowing, and harvesting as best they could. Livestock numbers dwindled, both from requisitions for the army and lack of feed. Local markets reflected scarcity. Butter, eggs, and grain were rationed, while bartering became a necessity rather than a convenience. Farmhouses were often converted into temporary hospitals or billets for soldiers passing through. Letters from sons and brothers on the front were read aloud at dinner, bringing both hope and worry into daily life. Economic pressure forced innovations. Crop rotation, shared equipment, and community-managed mills helped sustain production. Festivals and religious celebrations continued, scaled down and often improvised, maintaining morale despite hardship. Village schools taught practical skills, first aid, ration cooking, and agricultural techniques to prepare children for a world transformed by war. And amid the struggle, the rhythm of the seasons remained a subtle comfort, reminding villagers that life continued even in extraordinary circumstances. By summer 1917, communication had become a decisive factor in warfare. Field telegraphs buzzed constantly, connecting headquarters to forward units, while couriers braved artillery fire to deliver crucial orders. Wireless telegraphy allowed faster transmission, but it also created new opportunities for interception and espionage. Cryptographers worked tirelessly, creating and breaking codes that could mean the difference between victory and disaster. In occupied cities, spies moved discreetly, gathering intelligence on troop movements, supply lines, and morale. Civilians were sometimes recruited or coerced into minor intelligence tasks, passing notes hidden in newspapers, letters, or packages. At the front, officers relied on maps, coded messages, and runners to coordinate complex maneuvers, constantly adapting to enemy counterintelligence. Factories producing communication equipment operated day and night, supplying telegraph wires, radios, and signal flares. Propaganda subtly influenced morale and civilian cooperation, blending truth, rumor, and patriotic fervor. And despite the risks, small acts of cleverness, decoding a message, spotting a disguised patrol, or sending an unnoticed signal, could save lives and shift the course of a battle. By autumn 1917, chemical warfare had introduced a terrifying new dimension to battle. Mustard gas and chlorine attacks forced soldiers to carry masks at all times, yet exposure still caused burns, blindness, and lung damage. Field medics worked tirelessly, improvising treatments for injuries both visible and invisible, often with limited supplies. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and new surgical techniques and antiseptics were developed at unprecedented speed to save lives. Civilians were not immune. Gas clouds sometimes drifted over towns near the front, prompting emergency drills and protective measures. Pharmacies and factories were mobilized to produce bandages, antiseptics, and antidotes, highlighting the intertwined nature of war and economy. Soldiers relied on routine and camaraderie to endure fear, sharing stories and supporting one another through trauma. Nurses, often young and inexperienced, became indispensable, balancing technical skill with emotional care. Training manuals evolved rapidly, instructing soldiers on gas mask use, decontamination, and first aid. Newspapers described heroic recoveries and scientific breakthroughs, aiming to inspire morale despite the horror. And through these dark times, Human ingenuity, courage, and resilience shone as brightly as ever, preserving life amid relentless destruction. By winter 1917, the Russian front had become a landscape of both hardship and upheaval. Soldiers faced brutal cold, inadequate clothing, and endless mud, often struggling to keep trenches from collapsing under snow and ice. Supply lines were inconsistent, leaving units hungry and poorly equipped. Yet in this adversity, bonds of camaraderie deepened. Soldiers shared what little they had: bread, warm clothing, and stories from home to maintain morale. Villages behind the front were strained, as requisitioned horses, grain, and firewood left families struggling to survive. Peasants improvised, bartering goods and labor, sometimes hiding supplies to protect their livelihoods. Economic instability fed political tension. Revolutions and strikes simmered in cities and towns, hinting at sweeping social change. Letters and packages from relatives offered fleeting comfort, while local priests and elders provided counsel and spiritual support. Even in remote areas, schools and workshops adapted, teaching essential skills for survival amid shortages and conflict. Artists and photographers recorded these scenes, capturing the harsh realities of war and the quiet heroism of everyday life. And despite cold, hunger, and unrest, the resilience of soldiers and civilians alike preserved a fragile sense of humanity amidst chaos. By spring 1917, the war had transformed cities into industrial hubs of urgent production. Factories operated around the clock, producing artillery shells, uniforms, ammunition, and vehicles for the front. Men were scarce, conscripted to fight, so women stepped in, filling positions once considered male domains. They operated heavy machinery, worked in assembly lines, and handled logistics with remarkable skill and endurance. Child labor persisted in some workshops, contributing to family income while receiving basic education and practical tasks. Governments introduced rationing and wage controls to manage shortages, while local markets adapted with informal networks and bartering. Public transportation and housing were strained as cities swelled with workers. Newspapers and posters highlighted female contributions, often romanticizing their dedication to support the war effort. Social clubs and communal kitchens offered women respite, meals, and camaraderie amidst long shifts. Skilled artisans and engineers collaborated to optimize production, integrating new technologies with traditional craftsmanship. Despite fatigue, dangerous working conditions, and emotional stress, this industrial workforce became the backbone of national survival, demonstrating adaptability, resilience, and quiet heroism. By summer 1917, disease had become as dangerous as bullets on the battlefield. Trenches were breeding grounds for lice, rats, and infections, with dysentery and trench foot spreading rapidly. Field hospitals were overcrowded, and medical staff worked tirelessly to prevent epidemics, often improvising with limited supplies. Vaccination campaigns were launched against typhoid and smallpox, though distribution was uneven. Soldiers and civilians alike learned the importance of personal hygiene, boiling water, cleaning clothes, and disinfecting living spaces. In towns, sanitation officers monitored wells and markets, while nurses and volunteers taught proper hand-washing and wound care. Economically, governments prioritized the production of soap, disinfectants, and medical instruments, further straining industries already focused on war materials. Public awareness campaigns used posters and pamphlets, blending practical advice with patriotic messaging. Families adapted, isolating sick members and creating makeshift infirmaries at home. Even amid the chaos of war, these small measures saved countless lives, showing the crucial intersection of health, science, and human resilience in a world under siege. By autumn 1917, propaganda had become a central weapon on the home front. Newspapers printed stirring accounts of bravery and sacrifice, while posters adorned streets, urging citizens to save, enlist, or buy war bonds. Films, theater performances, and songs celebrated victories and heroism, shaping public perception of the conflict. Political leaders addressed the nation through radio broadcasts and speeches, blending patriotic fervor with promises of eventual peace. Schools introduced lessons about duty, courage, and national pride, fostering loyalty from a young age. Local clubs organized morale-boosting events, from concerts to sports competitions, giving civilians brief respite from rationing and hardship. Women's organizations collected clothing, food, and letters to send to soldiers, emphasizing collective responsibility. Satirical cartoons and illustrations, while entertaining, also conveyed subtle critiques and reinforced national narratives. Economically, the demand for paper, ink, and printing presses surged, creating jobs but also straining resources. Even in occupied territories, underground pamphlets and coded messages circulated, spreading hope and resistance. Through creativity, communication, and community, propaganda shaped both perception and reality, influencing emotions, decisions, and the course of daily life during the long, grueling war. By winter 1918, logistics had become a critical lifeline for armies across Europe. Railways were packed with troops, artillery, and supplies, yet bombed tracks, frozen switches, and overloaded stations frequently caused delays. Horses, trucks, and carts were pressed into service, forming long convoys that snaked through snow-covered countryside. Bridges damaged by shelling slowed transport, forcing engineers to improvise temporary structures under enemy fire. Supply shortages meant rations were often meager, and soldiers learned to make do with what they had, sharing food and clothing. Field depots became bustling hubs of activity, with clerks, laborers, and soldiers coordinating inventories amid constant urgency. Civilians in nearby towns contributed by loading wagons, repairing roads, or tending horses, often risking bombardment. Telegraph and radio systems facilitated coordination, but intercepted messages sometimes caused confusion or misdirected supplies. Economic pressures increased as governments allocated more resources to transportation, reducing civilian access to coal, timber, and other essentials. Yet, even amid these hardships, ingenuity flourished. Makeshift sleds, rope pulley systems, and innovative packing methods kept the lifelines moving. And through careful planning, tireless labor, and small acts of courage, armies sustained themselves, proving that supply chains could be as decisive as strategy or firepower in modern war. By spring 1918, civilians were living under constant stress and uncertainty. Air raid alarms, ration lines, and daily reports of casualties weighed heavily on families. Women juggled work in factories, farms, and households, while worrying about husbands, sons, and brothers at the front. Children adapted to a new reality, helping with chores, attending practical classes, and coping with the absence of loved ones. Communities organized mutual aid networks, offering food, childcare, and emotional support to those affected by war. Letters became a lifeline, read and reread for comfort and connection. Political tensions simmered as strikes, protests, and debates over conscription and food distribution reflected growing dissatisfaction. Yet creativity flourished. Theater performances, local music ensembles, and artistic endeavors offered brief escapes from hardship. Economically, families improvised, growing small gardens, preserving food, and bartering goods to survive scarcity. Spiritual life provided solace. Religious services, prayers, and rituals helped maintain hope and resilience. Even in cities under occupation or threat, the human spirit adapted, showing that psychological endurance, community solidarity, and ingenuity were essential tools for survival during prolonged conflict. By summer 1918, the Western Front was a stage of relentless offensives and desperate defense. Armies moved with precision, yet exhaustion weighed heavily on soldiers who had endured years of constant fighting. Artillery barges reshaped the landscape, leaving craters, shattered trees, and ruined villages in their wake. Officers coordinated complex maneuvers, relying on maps, signals, and runners, while troops pushed forward under machine gun fire. Morale fluctuated. Some units celebrated small victories with cheers and songs, while others grieved fallen comrades in the mud of trenches. Reinforcements arrived sporadically, and soldiers adapted by sharing food, mending uniforms, and tending the wounded themselves. Cavalry and infantry coordinated cautiously, advancing only when reconnaissance suggested feasible movement. Civilians behind the front observed distant smoke, fearing for loved ones while struggling with shortages at home. Innovations such as creeping barges and combined arms tactics showcased human ingenuity amidst chaos. Letters and postcards provided fleeting comfort, bridging the gap between battlefield and hearth. And in these final offensives, courage, fatigue, and determination intertwined, illustrating the relentless human spirit at the war's climax. By November 1918, the world held its breath as news of an impending armistice spread. On the Western Front, soldiers cautiously lowered their weapons, wary of false alarms, but hopeful for peace. Trenches once filled with relentless fire fell silent, punctuated only by cheers, laughter, and cautious singing. Officers and enlisted men alike embraced, sharing relief and disbelief that the long nightmare was ending. Civilians in towns and cities celebrated with flags, bonfires, and spontaneous parades, their faces reflecting exhaustion, joy, and uncertainty about the future. Factories and workshops shifted from wartime production to rebuilding efforts, signaling the start of economic recovery. Families reunited. Children ran into the arms of parents who had been absent for years. Governments negotiated terms and borders, yet the shadow of social unrest and political change lingered. Newspapers recounted stories of heroism, survival, and loss, helping communities process grief and pride together. Musicians, poets, and artists captured the emotional spectrum of the moment, memorializing both sacrifice and hope. And amid the jubilation, a quiet reflection took hold. The human cost had been immense, but resilience, courage, and solidarity had endured, shaping a new era from the ashes of war. By spring 1919, Europe faced the immense task of rebuilding after 4 years of devastation. Cities lay in ruins, factories were damaged, and homes destroyed, leaving thousands displaced. Refugees moved along makeshift routes, carrying belongings in carts, sacks, or even on foot, seeking shelter with relatives or in temporary camps. Governments and relief organizations organized aid, distributing food, blankets, and medical supplies, though resources were always limited. Children often walked long distances with families, helping wherever possible. Local markets reopened gradually, with barter and improvised goods sustaining communities until full recovery was possible. Artists and journalists documented the destruction and resilience, bringing attention to the human cost and the hope for reconstruction. Women, who had held societies together during the war, now led community rebuilding efforts, from organizing schools to repairing roads and public buildings. Social tensions flared occasionally as shortages, land disputes, and political disagreements emerged, yet the overarching mood combined weariness with cautious optimism. Across the continent, people cleared rubble, planted gardens, and rekindled small businesses, demonstrating the determination to restore life amid the scars of conflict. By summer 1919, Europe faced an economic storm as wartime debts, destroyed infrastructure, and disrupted trade led to soaring inflation. Prices for food, clothing, and basic goods skyrocketed, forcing families to ration and improvise. Unemployment surged as returning soldiers joined civilians competing for scarce jobs. People resorted to street markets, bartering, and small-scale farming to survive. Children helped at home or sold homemade goods to contribute to family income. Banks and governments struggled to stabilize currency, often introducing new bills or price controls that met with mixed success. Cities witnessed long lines at bakeries, crowded public transportation, and bustling labor markets where everyone sought opportunities to earn. Women, who had become integral to wartime production, faced new challenges, balancing household budgets, supporting children, and navigating shifting social roles. Informal networks, neighbors sharing meals, local workshops exchanging labor, helped communities endure. Newspapers reported strikes, protests, and political debates over economic policies, highlighting both frustration and civic engagement. Amid scarcity and uncertainty, resilience, ingenuity, and solidarity became daily tools for survival and rebuilding, shaping the new post-war society. By autumn 1919, Europe's political map was transforming. Empires had collapsed. Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German territories were being divided into new nations. Citizens debated borders, governance, and citizenship, often participating in rallies, local councils, or town meetings. Women, who had contributed heavily during the war, increasingly demanded voting rights and representation. Strikes and protests erupted over labor conditions, inflation, and food scarcity, reflecting frustration and political awakening. Newspapers and pamphlets circulated ideas of socialism, liberalism, and nationalism, sparking discussions in cafes, schools, and homes. Refugees and displaced populations influenced political choices as communities struggled to integrate newcomers while preserving traditions. International agreements, such as the Treaty of Versailles, dominated headlines and personal conversations alike, inspiring both hope and resentment. Local elections became platforms for voices long silenced, while social clubs and youth movements encouraged civic engagement. Despite uncertainty, people's desire to shape their own futures grew, signaling the birth of new democracies and social contracts. Through debate, activism, and negotiation, societies sought balance between justice, survival, and the lessons of a devastating war. By spring 1920, Europe's cultural landscape reflected the trauma and resilience of the Great War. Painters captured shattered landscapes, empty trenches, and the silent grief of families, blending realism with romantic melancholy. Writers chronicled stories of soldiers and civilians alike, balancing heroism, despair, and irony, while poets distilled loss into vivid, haunting verses. Theaters staged plays that questioned authority, war, and human nature, while music ensembles composed pieces reflecting both sorrow and hope. Public exhibitions displayed artifacts, letters, and photographs, preserving memory while encouraging reflection. Artists experimented with new styles, breaking traditional forms to convey unprecedented experiences. Schools and universities integrated contemporary works, helping the younger generation understand the war's societal impact. Literature and visual arts became tools of collective processing, a means to make sense of devastation and honor the endurance of ordinary people. Coffee houses and salons buzzed with debates about meaning, morality, and memory, fueling intellectual and emotional renewal. Even in rural villages, folk songs and improvised performances preserved stories, blending communal identity with individual loss. Through creativity, Europe sought not only to record history, but also to rebuild its soul. By summer 1920, women across Europe had permanently reshaped the social landscape. During the war, they had worked in factories, farms, hospitals, and offices, keeping economies and communities afloat. After the conflict, many retained these roles, gaining independence and respect previously denied. Schools, offices, and workshops increasingly employed women in professional and skilled positions. Women organized social clubs, political groups, and educational societies, advocating for rights, literacy, and health reforms. In cities, mothers juggled household duties with paid work, creating schedules and systems to manage both. In rural areas, women balanced farm labor with family care, often improvising tools and methods to increase efficiency. Fashion and personal expression subtly reflected empowerment, with practical clothing replacing restrictive garments. Media and literature began highlighting women's voices and stories, celebrating their contributions during wartime and beyond. Despite societal resistance, these changes set the stage for greater participation in governance, workforce, and cultural life. Daily routines combined resilience, innovation, and solidarity, showing how women had become architects of post-war recovery. By autumn 1920, the continent was still struggling with the massive displacement caused by the war. Families traveled for miles, carrying what little they could salvage, hoping to find safety and stability. Temporary camps sprang up in towns and outskirts, offering basic shelter, communal kitchens, and makeshift schools. Communities worked together to integrate newcomers, sharing knowledge of local customs, trade opportunities, and farming techniques. Children learned quickly, adapting to new schools, languages, and friends. Local economies benefited from new labor, but also faced tension as resources were scarce. Religious and charitable organizations provided essential support, from food and clothing to emotional counseling. Many refugees documented their journeys through letters, diaries, and drawings, creating records of human endurance. Markets and workshops reflected a blend of local and migrant crafts, fostering cultural exchange. Despite hardships, laughter, games, and music often emerged in camps, reminding people of life beyond survival. These migrations reshaped neighborhoods, forged unexpected alliances, and strengthened resilience, illustrating humanity's capacity to adapt and rebuild even after profound disruption. By spring 1921, signs of economic recovery appeared across European cities and industrial towns. Factories reopened, producing textiles, machinery, and consumer goods, while trade routes gradually restored connections between regions. Markets buzzed with renewed activity. Farmers brought fresh produce. Artisans displayed handcrafted items, and shopkeepers welcomed customers with cautious optimism. Streets echoed with the sounds of carts, trams, and bustling crowds, signaling life returning to normal. Workers, including women who had remained in the workforce, took pride in rebuilding their livelihoods. Small enterprises flourished, experimenting with innovations learned during wartime necessity. Banks cautiously offered loans to restart businesses, and local governments invested in infrastructure repairs, from bridges to roads and ports. Children returned to schools with eagerness, and cultural events, concerts, exhibitions, and theater performances reintroduced joy and entertainment into public life. Families, now reunited and somewhat stabilized, could celebrate milestones and plan for the future. Despite lingering scars, the combination of resilience, entrepreneurship, and communal support fostered hope and gradual prosperity across the continent. By summer 1921, European medicine faced the immense challenge of caring for war-wounded veterans and populations weakened by scarcity and disease. Hospitals, often overcrowded, provided treatment for amputees, infections, and psychological trauma, while nurses, many of whom had served during the war, continued their vital work. Prosthetic workshops thrived, producing advanced limb replacements for soldiers, blending craftsmanship with emerging engineering techniques. Public health campaigns promoted vaccination, hygiene, and nutrition, addressing both wartime neglect and post-war epidemics. Scientists and doctors shared research internationally, advancing knowledge of trauma, infectious disease, and surgical innovations. Pharmacies bustled with people seeking remedies for lingering ailments and new medications. Rural communities relied on traveling physicians and improvised clinics, while urban hospitals introduced specialized wards for rehabilitation and mental health care. Families learned new practices for wound care, nutrition, and preventative health. Schools integrated basic health education, emphasizing the importance of community well-being. Amid the challenges, hope and scientific curiosity flourished, as medicine not only healed bodies but also became a cornerstone of post-war recovery and societal resilience. By winter 1922, Europe carried the invisible scars of the Great War. Soldiers returned with memories of trenches, battles, and comrades lost, while civilians bore the grief of displaced families, destroyed homes, and lost livelihoods. Communities organized remembrance ceremonies, erecting monuments and holding vigils, allowing collective mourning and recognition of sacrifices. Diaries, letters, and memoirs became cherished records, capturing individual experiences for posterity. Schools incorporated history lessons, emphasizing the human cost of conflict, while public lectures and exhibitions fostered understanding and empathy. Psychologists and emerging mental health professionals began addressing shell shock and trauma, slowly building awareness of psychological recovery. Art and theater depicted nightmares, hope, and resilience, helping people process grief and fear. Families created rituals and storytelling traditions to pass memories to the next generation. Local newspapers and magazines published survivor stories, giving voice to ordinary people. Despite lingering sorrow, communities sought meaning, solidarity, and renewal, ensuring that the lessons of the war remained part of collective consciousness. Through remembrance, Europe aimed to honor the past while cautiously imagining a future of peace and resilience.